Welcome to the City Council regular meeting of January 5th, 2021, 6:30. At this time, we will stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and prayer by Councilwoman Perez. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, Lord, your will be done on the earth as it is in the heavens. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, Father, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.
Amen. At this time, we will have questions and comments from any citizen that would like to speak. And I don't see any, so we'll move on to the consent items.
I move to approve consent items 5 through 7.
Second.
All in favor? And that passes. Next, we'll move on to item number 8. Consider and take appropriate action on final reading of ordinance O-001-21, amending the City of Borger Code of Ordinances, Article 11.04, Hotel Motel Occupancy Tax. Mr. Edwards?
Yes, Council, this is the second reading of this ordinance. This is an amendment to our existing Code of Ordinances for the 7% hotel occupancy tax that we've been, adopted many years ago. The reason for the change is to make the collection process identical to the new venue tax ordinance that is in the next ordinance. But that's the primary reason for the change in this ordinance. It's just, that way it just makes reporting of those two tax revenues, those tax streams identical, make it much easier for the hotel owners to make those processes.
Is there any questions? This is the final reading?
No.
Okay, then I'll entertain a motion.
I move to adopt on final reading ordinance O-001-21, repealing and replacing in its entirety Article 11.04 Hotel Motel Occupancy Tax of the City of Borger Code of Ordinances.
Second.
All in favor? And it passes. Item number 9, consider and take appropriate action on final reading of ordinance O-002-21, amending the City of Borger Code of Ordinance by creating Article 11.05 venue tax. Mr. Edwards.
This article is a new article to the Code of Ordinances. It is as a direct result of the election of November 3rd, where the voters passed, the imposition of a venue tax. This actually puts the wording and the verbiage in our Code of Ordinances to impose that tax. Once it's finally approved, it'll go to a couple of advertisements in the paper before it becomes law. What we're planning on do as soon as this is passed, probably as soon as tomorrow, we will send a letter along with a copy of both of these ordinances to all of the hotel owners and even the Airbnb operators if we know who they are, and try to have that established for rentals on February 1st thereafter. And their first reporting period for the new tax would be March of 2021. So.
Is there any questions or comments? If not, we'll entertain a motion.
I move to adopt a final reading ordinance O-002-21, creating Article 11.05 venue tax into the City of Borger Code of Ordinances, imposing a 2% venue tax on the nightly cost of all short-term rental space in the City of Borger.
Second.
All in favor?
Sorry
And
about
it
that.
passes. Moving on to item 10, conduct a public hearing on the following: the Borger Downtown Revitalization Plan and the Borger Parks, Trails, and Recreation Master Plan. Mr. Bradley.
So We finally reached the end of our supplemental plans that we've been working on for both downtown and the parks plan. And so we're have one final public hearing on both of these before we adopt them in the next items. But Matt with Kindig Keast is here for this presentation. This is very similar to the one we had at the joint meeting. But one more opportunity for public education and public feedback on these plans. So we'll start with the downtown plan, and I'll let Matt take it from here.
Hi.
Hi, Matt.
Nice to see everyone again. Thanks. And pleasure to be here on behalf of the Kindig Keast Collaborative and also our sub-consultant Park Hill to present to you both plans this evening, the downtown plan and also the Parks, Trails, and Recreation plan that we'll be going over next. So really, this is a culmination of coming close to almost 2 years of effort at this point when we start talking about the comprehensive plan effort. And really, the feedback we started hearing during that effort is what led to these plans, because these were very important issues to the community. So we wanted, and working with you folks, come back and kind of drill down on these two supplemental plans. The first, this existing downtown plan, similar how our process works for comprehensive planning. We take a look at Borger's downtown as it is today first. We say, what's there now? What's on the ground? What are the demographics? What are the market forces driving different things to happen? Really want to know more about Borger, in this case, specifically Borger downtown and the surrounding environments, to know, what it is that will take, the efforts needed to make Borger's downtown specifically more successful in the future. We do a number of things as part of this. One of it is to look at Borger more regionally, where it is in the Panhandle. In this particular effort, this slide just sort of is an example of what that really means in terms of trade area. Downtowns thrive on commerce and people coming in and out, being those not only the central business district, but the activity centers. And as we started to talk to various residents, business owners, very clear trend came about that there's two types of shoppers that come to Borger. One is signified by what we call a primary trade area, which is that orange sort of middle section, which is really Borger and its ETJ limits. These are your shoppers that are here every day. They live here. They work here. They're coming to businesses 2, 3, maybe 4 times a week. They're every day. But really, there's a number of businesses or activities, whether you're coming to Borger for work or to come to the Morley Theater or some other, where there's a bigger draw than just those folks. They come here for these activities, and they're coming probably less frequently, once a week, twice a month, maybe less. But they're bringing activity here, and it's important to kind of acknowledge that. And that's really what we looked at with the region. We framed it in these two trade areas. That really fed into the recommendations that come later in the future phase. There's kind of two overview or high level focus areas in the existing plan. One was physical assessment of what's going on the ground. When we really started to look at it, we said, what is the downtown area for this plan? And it's shown on this slide. We call it the downtown core area. This is really where activity and a lot of the recommendations for this plan specifically are focused. And the rationale behind that is it's nice to have a center of gravity first, and then you can worry about expanding beyond that to what we've called the downtown kind of context area. Once you have the center of gravity built up and things really going, that's when you can start expanding there. But it's really best to concentrate your funding, your efforts, everything right there at first to really build that up as you go. As part of this, we looked at vacancy, we looked at land values, we looked at on-street parking spaces, off-street parking spaces, really all those things that matter to downtowns and shopping districts in general, just to say, this is what we need, this is what Borger's going to want to focus on as we go through into the future recommendations in terms of the physical needs. We also, having gone through the comprehensive plan effort, heard some comments about various things, and the next 2 slides are just one example of, we really wanted to take those comments and drill down on some more issues because they can have a really positive impact if done right on downtown. This particular slide shows that we heard over and over and over again, comp plan and in this plan, there's not enough market rate rental housing at Borger. And downtowns are sort of a natural magnet for that. So we wanted to put some data to that in terms of the region and say, what does that mean? And so one of the things we did was look at a comparison between Borger's existing percentage of rental housing in terms of their overall housing stock. And we looked at how that compares to bigger cities, Amarillo in this case, and also the state of Texas. And we found there is a gap there percentage-wise. Now, not all that gap can be explained purely by, market forces, Some of it can be, some of it's probably just preference things, maybe folks here find it a little easier to buy a home because the land value is that. So it's not a direct comparison, but at least helped us kind of frame that idea that, yeah, there's something going on here. There's something to that comment. This slide kind of drove it home when we looked at the income cohorts right here from people that make between $35,000 and $75,000. Those are generally the income ranges you'd expect to be attracted to rental market rate homes. Lower than that, you're kind of in the subsidized area. Above that, you're probably dealing with homeowners as opposed to, and we just said, based on those percentages we talked about on the previous slide, is there something here? And what we found is even at 24%, there's about a need for 520 some odd apartments market rate, those two income cohorts. And when you look at town, we didn't go into a deep dive, but when you kind of do an initial analysis, there's not that many in town. So I think what this does is help us prove that, yeah, there's a market here for that. And when you round up to the bigger percentages, the 38 that we saw in other communities, it's even more. While we're doing this data and this research, going out, we wanted more public input. We wanted to know more about downtown specifically. We talked to the downtown merchants when we started the comprehensive plan process and other business owners, but we really wanted to dive deeper into what the town felt about Borger's downtown and also what's out there, what are the business owners seeing. That's part of how we came up with that trade area. They're the ones that told us that they have shoppers coming from beyond Borger's limits. And so we did that. We did interviews one-on-one with business owners in the BEDC. We sent out an online survey in May, which received well over 300 responses, had a great response. A lot of great feedback when we asked about when you come downtown, when you shop here, how often do you come downtown? And then we asked a series of questions about images where we said, what do you want downtown to look like? And that all gets fed into the future plan that we're about to talk about next. We met with the Tiers Board multiple times. They were a great sounding board, very, very instructive, very, to their credit, we would propose some things and they'd say, no, that doesn't make sense. And we said, okay, that we want to make sure this plan reflects what this community wants. And that's really what this slide's all about. We wanted to make sure you got a plan that works for Borger. It's not just something that we come up with, based on what happens other places in Texas, the nation, that it's what Borger wants. All that information feeds right into what we call the future downtown plan. So instead of Borger's downtown as it is today, this is Borger's downtown 20 years from now. This is the vision document. Again, it's kind of split up into two higher level categories: physical changes, recommendations for physical changes, I should say, and then also 4 other subsections that really focus on more policy level items, things you can do to help promote downtown, have more events, help entrepreneurs come to downtown and make Borger's downtown attractive to those folks. So all those things, each one has its own action steps. The other thing we looked at is some issues came out very clear during this process. Parking, outdated infrastructure in certain areas, evening and nighttime activity is, pretty minimal in downtown Borger currently, so that's something to build on. But also opportunities. There's some physical changes that could help facilitate that. Placemaking we'll get into in a little bit, business incubation, partnerships with other organizations, ways to, help promote downtown. And the most interesting thing we heard over and over and over again was dragging main. That started with the comprehensive plan process, and we asked some more questions about that in the existing downtown phase and said, there's something to this, but what is that? So we asked another question. It really became the driving force behind all the action steps and recommendations in the future downtown plan, which is, it wasn't just about coming downtown and driving up and down Main Street. It was pretty clear to us that this was the activity where people got to see their friends, they got to socialize, they got to get together, and they knew it was regular and you just did it, and that people really missed it. They missed that interaction more than anything else. I mean, we heard that loud and clear. So as we start talking about physical changes and recommendations, we really took that dragging main concept and fed that into another sort of concept, which is placemaking, which basically is a good place in order to have activity and constant, involvement should have at least 10 focus points. That's kind of the number as studies have shown you. Have different areas and they can be spread out. They don't have to be all concentrated in one area, but there needs to be enough differentiation and enough places for people to go so they want to walk around. They want to explore new activities, or as we really framed it in this, dragging Main. It's kind of a new version of dragging Main. It doesn't have to be in your car. There just has to be places for people to want to go to and walk up and down, get to those places. And then the little color nodes kind of show different types of activities. There's the red ones represent current businesses. You know, they're bringing activity downtown. The yellow ones will get into a little more detail. Those are the catalyst sites where we're actually recommending physical changes in downtown. Purple ones represent kind of, you have these little vestibules, the pergolas outside, the gazebos, little pocket parks you could have, you know, people do live performances, those things. So these are the areas where those make sense. But if you look at the graphic, it really shows it going up and down Main Street. That, you know, bringing it back to dragging Main. There were 3 catalyst sites, just to highlight how that looks in the plan. This one focuses on the one we think has probably the most immediate benefit, which is restructuring Main Street's right of way to be more straight, removing the serpentine pattern. You know, I know there's a grant application out there to potentially do one of the blocks. This really just follows that pattern, and it does a couple of nice things. One, it moves the traffic lanes into the center, so it straightens out that pattern that we talked about, but it also creates more on-street parking with the angled, and as we've shown it, more opportunities for landscaping around mid-block crossings. So people don't have to go all the way up to the corner to cross the street. There'll be mid-block crossings, and that actually can create more performance venues. The other thing this highlights is when we really dug into that, if you look at right out here in front of City Hall, which is the image on the right, it gives you the opportunity to extend the sidewalk in front of Main Street because you don't need on-street parking there. You have a parking lot right north of the building. You could create a whole new little plaza area with public art displays, or even just use it during parades as they come by. That's where the Grand Marshal could be. Kind of extends City Hall's activity past business hours, which, you know, goes back to placemaking, dragging Main. It gives you another reason to get up and down the street. This slide really just shows how each section has action steps. These are the ones tied to the physical changes we're recommending, but also highlights on the left that we're not just giving you words. There's a lot of examples and best practices incorporated in the plan. So this one highlights what kind of performance nodes you should have or could have. You know, you can do other ones, obviously, but these are some good examples, at least what other communities have done that have really helped. This next slide is an example of one of the sections that focuses on something more policy related. We've highlighted branding here this evening because that kind of gets interwoven into everything. When you're creating a brand, there's physical parts of that, whether it be a logo or banners that get hung on new street lights, or, you know, just getting that word out, that narrative that, hey, you need to come downtown and re-drag Main like we used to do every Friday night because there's something going on here, whether that be new businesses through encouraging entrepreneurs or activities and events. But that just gets woven in through all the fabric of what we're talking about. So we wanted to highlight that this evening. And then, of course, you know, you can have all these great ideas and all these recommendations and action steps, but there has to be a path to moving forward to that. So what we've done is highlight some ways forward to do that in terms of developing a project management team, assessing your goals every year, every 2 years to see if they're making sense or if you've accomplished some, what comes next. And the graphic on the left really highlights that this is a process that builds on itself. You start with the key steps, and some Borger's already done, which is something we've emphasized through this whole planning effort is Borger's, you know, the council, the staff, everybody, you know, there's a lot of key places and key pieces in place for this. You know, like a tiers district, for instance, that are there. So some of these things you guys are probably a couple of those notes up on this process, but what it really kind of shows you is that the longer you go, things might get more time intensive and expensive, but you got to take those initial steps to get there. That's why we call it the development ramp up. And finally, all the action steps are reincorporated into this section in a table, and they're ranked based on each individual section. The ones that have a rank of 1 are the ones that you want to probably take on first. Doesn't mean you have to do them in this order. Grant opportunities come along, other things come along, so they might get re-changed year to year, but really we try to highlight those, what we consider the foundational steps that really make the most sense as you move forward. And with that, kind of wraps up the formal part of the presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Matt, how many cities Borger size have gone this far as getting and working on a plan? I assume that number is very small in your experience.
Generally, they do a comp plan for sure, and then
Yeah.
the supplemental plan's not as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a direct number off the top of my head, but it's a percentage of our clients, I'd say 60 to 70% probably stop at comp plan.
Okay. And most of the cities that you deal with, I assume, are growth cities. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah, so
They're
the
suburbs,
population's on the.
The population's on the rise.
Yeah,
Okay.
nationally, it's a mix. We work with plenty that are growing, like the city of Dayton, but we've worked with others, like Hobbs, New Mexico, that aren't necessarily.
Yeah.
Most recently, we worked on a comprehensive planning effort with Freeport, closer to Houston, very similar to Borger. Their population's declining, large industrial base, employment base still, but not necessarily the residential growth, those things. They have not gone to do a downtown plan yet. They
Yeah.
talked about it, but they didn't go that far. They just did the comprehensive plan.
And I remember the comparison with Freeport, because they were very similar.
Right.
And I guess, and this is probably a bizarre question, but I often like an outsider's view, and that's obviously why we hired an
Sure,
outsider
yeah,
to
absolutely.
make a plan, because it far exceeds my ability to even contemplate. What kind of grade would you give Borger as to where we're at and where we're trying to go? And are we a B student? And this is the former teacher coming out.
It's,
And that's probably not a very fair question. It's kind of out of left field, way out of left field, but
but I appreciate that, because you're trying to see, where you are in the grander scheme of things. I know we've said this, Gary's mentioned it multiple times since we started the comprehensive planning process. Borger's in good shape from what we see. There are challenges, it's not perfect. But,
yeah, obviously.
But, in terms of downtown, we've had clients where you go on Main Street, there's nothing. There's boarded up buildings beginning to, north to south or east to west, depending on the city, and there's nothing there. There's businesses here. Some of them are doing well. Some of them, want to do better, obviously. And that's a lot of what we built into this plan is there's a good base here. It just needs a couple of extra things to help, continue that momentum. And really, I mentioned it earlier, staff and the city council have done some great things to set that up already. So I give staff and council an A. They're doing what they should be doing to help do those things. It's the other parts just have to come along.
Yeah.
We were very surprised, when we first got here, that Borger's in the shape. It's really doing those things and trying to make those efforts to make those happen. Like, just the last time I was here, I know Katie was in front of you guys buying those buildings south of here. Most cities don't take that on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the efforts that really will, pay the long dividends.
Okay, and I thank you. I value an outside opinion, because you can become ingrown.
Sure.
And you may think you know what's going on, but I appreciate your direct answer, and I'm happy for the good report.
Yeah, and the only addendum I'd make to that is, you're still at a place where it's not done yet.
Oh, yeah.
Keep pushing.
No,
because it can get there, but it's not
Yeah,
yet.
no,
so.
just this snapshot in time. Okay.
And
No,
yeah,
that-
my experience on the public sector side from the Midwest, been to many towns in the Midwest where there's because they're mostly rural based.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing left. In Iowa, southern parts of Illinois, where the population is leaving in droves, there's not a lot of activity there, unfortunately.
Yeah, and my take is we have to work, or we can go down with everybody else. Small towns just tend to get smaller, and big towns are the engines, and they get bigger. Kids leave here and go to Amarillo in our case. But I don't want to go down without a fight.
Sure.
So I think that's the attitude of this council. We want to do everything we can to make Borger what it could be and should be, within the constraints of what our revenue is. So,
Yep.
Thank you, Matt.
Yep, absolutely.
I don't have any more questions.
I'm just, I can't remember on the, your steps.
Mhm.
Was there one about the rental? Because I can see where rental would affect downtown, people living here and shopping downtown. I didn't notice, I can't remember, or maybe I didn't look at it really good on.
Yeah, and there, in the plan itself, there's a whole section devoted to that, which
Okay.
up here, it's housing as a business driver. And I think we talked about that in more detail last time. For the purposes of tonight, we didn't want to necessarily
Okay.
step through all the action items, but yeah, there's definitely a lot in there. A lot of it's tied to the Hotel Borger site, finding someone to possibly redevelop that building
Right.
as,
Yeah.
loft apartments, urban apartments. There's some very specific direction on that, and building almost a complementary building on the parking lot side to do that as well.
And this plan, it's gonna, to me, it would help those type of people coming in, that maybe would develop, the hotels and stuff, to see that we have a plan going, and for grants and things, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and it ties back to the comprehensive plan, because we're making sure that the areas are shown in the future land use map that are appropriate for rental development. And then this plan kind of further elaborates on that, and what this plan did is prove the case through the data that I discussed earlier, but then also showed physically how you can make it work on a site. And the next phase, we're just getting underway now, the ULDO will actually have the uses permitted with the right heights and the right areas and parking requirements, and to a developer to look at that and say, oh yeah, I can make that work because it's here in the ordinance.
Because keep in mind too, right now, the central business district, which is the zone for downtown, was, it's back to 1964 when the central business district was geared to be retail only and shopping and business only. So we have some hurdles in our regulations that are there right now that prevent housing and some of those other types of development in the downtown core, and that's one of the big reasons that we've gone on and are starting to develop the Unified Land Development Ordinance to
Makes
update
sense.
those so that we can diversify downtown from
Make
what
those
what
uses
19
available.
Right, so we're actually stepping forward into that plan.
Yes.
Yep. And
I think you
didn't-
think of the UNLD is a change from the planning to the implementation, because now we need to put the regulations in place that support what the plan says needs to happen.
Right. And a good example of that is, like Garrett pointed out, there's no real residential rental uses permitted in that district. The new district, it's recommended in this plan that you look at downtown and say, maybe on Main Street, you don't want to have first floor apartments because you want the retail activity and the businesses, but there's no reason you shouldn't have them on the second and third story buildings for the buildings that have that. So look at ways to not only incorporate that in the ULDO, but possible grant and assistance items to make that happen as well. So that's all woven into the fabric of this downtown plan. It'll be continued into the implementation through the ULDO.
And we need this stuff to get grants, and we like Fed and state money,
Absolutely.
so.
So I guess we'll open a public hearing on the downtown revitalization plan. And if anyone would like to speak. And if I see none, so we'll close the, I'm new at that, so I wasn't sure. And then we'll move on to,
Yep.
go on
Parks
to the
and Recs.
next one. Okay, I'm sorry, y'all. Okay, so we'll move on to item 10.
No, the same item, but now we have a
Oh,
presentation
yeah,
of the.
yeah,
On the Parks
sorry,
and
the same
Trails.
item. Parks and Rec. Parks
There we go.
and- Okay. Sorry about that.
Thank you. And the second presentation, again, came out of feedback from the comprehensive plan effort. We heard a lot about parks in Borger, and people like the park system in Borger, would like to see it improved, would like some ways to do that, and so we embarked on the Parks, Trails, and Recreation Master Plan, which the public feedback was certainly part of that, but the other one, is we've just sort of hinted at this, is there's a lot of different avenues available to a city if they have a parks plan in place through the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, with the second bullet point up there. There's competitive grants out there, and having a plan like this that shows priority, shows need, really helps with that process, because that's something they look at, and there's keys, and the next slide gets into that. But it was also about just seeing what the status of Borger's parks were. One of the first things we noted through the comprehensive plan effort is Borger has a lot of parks, and so some are more used than others. Some have, more features than others. So what does that really mean, and what does that imply? And also, it's another way to possibly bring in economic development and drive activity to Borger, especially being close to Lake Meredith, other regional assets such as Bates, Flint quarries. Maybe this is another way to get people to, stay in the region a little longer and come to Borger. I mentioned grants on the previous slide, but really it's what the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department calls an acceptable plan. They have specific guidelines for, you have to have very specific information in there. These are the items, and our plan is set up to mirror exactly what they look for. So it's easy for them to find that information. It compares to what they call their criteria so that you can go in there, and it's very easy for them to find. It just helps with the scoring to make sure that all that information's in there, and then helps you submit your grant applications when those opportunities arise.
Can I ask you a question about the grants? Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I was thinking that you said something about, maybe I was wrong, but that it helps or builders, the part, isn't there something that ties to the builders with parks or something that you talked about last time? I can't remember now, maybe I'm.
We had talked about that in the Unified Land Development, when we talked about park requirements for land development. And so since we have a lot of parks, we might be able to reduce park requirements on someone that's wanting to come in and develop subdivisions
Okay.
and things like that.
Okay, that's what it was. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, yeah, I remember now.
A lot of overlapping projects, so totally understand. But yeah, absolutely. What we usually do in the ULDO is say you can have more density when you're doing a residential development if you provide green space. Borger's in the
Okay, I
fortunate
see.
position, and there's a slide that'll talk about this in more detail, to say we have a lot of park space already. Maybe we can give a builder that same density bonus through utilizing the existing park system based on proximity, redevelopment, those things. So they get that same density bonus, which entices them to develop, but it's already built into the system since it's already here. And so that's something we're still working through. To be honest, that's unique for Borger. Most towns don't have enough existing parks. That's something that you always kind of have to require because it wasn't there. But here, it's already there. So
Right.
again, this plan was built on public input. That's part of the Texas Parks and Wildlife criteria, but also it's core to what we do on every plan. And we did a lot of similar efforts. We did an online survey in June, got over 100 responses. It was a great turnout, especially as people were kind of sitting around and wanted, we saw those great invites come out from the city, wanted to get there and get their input in. We did listening sessions online. We did a virtual town hall, which was a first for me, where Garrett and myself, you can see those two guys up there sitting right here on Facebook Live, and had some pretty good interaction, had a lot of views, had a lot of people participate and comment, and were able to ask us questions in real time, but virtually. And so given everything that's happened, that was actually fun for me, because that was the first. I'm starting to think I'm becoming social media famous. I've been on Facebook Live a lot.
Better keep your day job.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not much of an influencer, I guess. So the plan has 6 sections, and then an appendices after that. These are aligned with the acceptable plan criteria. These are what the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department looks for. The introduction is...
Quick question.
Oh, sure.
The Texas Park and
Wildlife Department?
they require on a grant that we have done queries to our population? They have that expectation?
Yes, they want to know that you're basing your recommendations on existing conditions. Demographics is part of that.
Okay, and that's one of their requirements for grants?
Yeah, that's part of what they look for as part of an acceptable plan,
Okay.
which, just roll right into the next slide, which is really, the introduction section talks about the purposes of the plan, talks about the different sections of the plan, but it's very similar to the existing downtown report, except this is the format that TPWD looks for, where it's, here's the information they want to know about, things that make sense that you highlight for parks, location and climate, so for recommendations for landscaping, those items, demographics, the local assets and resources, and also the city's role in the provision of park plans, because cities do that differently. Borger has its own parks department that's part of the city apparatus, but other places have a separate park district or, a separate group, it's a different taxing body in some cases, so they want to know that. The second section is goals and objectives, and that's pretty much what it says. These are 6 goals that were developed based on the public input and our on-the-ground efforts that we'll talk about in more detail in the next slides. But really, these are the 6 goals that frame what the park system here in Borger needs and how we're going to achieve them. These are the goals you're trying to strive for. And in the plan itself, there's sub-goals that kind of get into more specifics on each one of these. The third section is concepts and standards. And this is kind of setting up the process where you look at site evaluation criteria. These are specific to Borger. We developed them as we were going through this plan effort. Metrics, really just kind of looking at how Borger compares nationally. It used to be this group, the NRPA, would put out kind of standards based on surveys that they do. And in the last year and a half, they changed that. They said, you know, everybody's quoting our standards, but a park in Alaska doesn't make sense to compare to a park in Texas. So they've gone more to metrics. And part of that reporting, which is really helpful, is they've started to kind of separate out averages based on the communities they survey by population size. So Borger's not being compared to Amarillo anymore. You know, there's a specific category for cities of 20,000 population and under. And those are what you see reflected on the slide here. And really, they look at playgrounds and say, you know, every town has an average of 6 per so many residents or kids. And that's something we use as, it's not really a benchmark anymore. It's just good to know if you have any outliers under or over. You know, you might have a lot of something, you might have a little. This is how you compare to other cities across the country. The local parks classification system, this is based on just what you call your parks, where they're smaller. The next slide will go into more detail on that, but specific to Borger, you know, they have a certain size based on what they offer. There's different types of parks, so there's a classification system built with some standards that kind of help set up what each one it is, and that's good for planning future parks, but also comparing parks to themselves.
Is the grant process looking at their metrics? This organization, the NRPA, are they tied into by state or Fed mandate to anything?
It's hard for me to say definitively because I've never been on the other side of the review process. I think what my understanding is what they look for is that you've proved up your case for the recommendations that are coming later.
Okay.
These metrics help you do that.
So this is a recognized authority for metrics. Okay.
What's gonna be hard is if it says we need 5 playgrounds and we have 12 and your grant is asking for a 13th, it's gonna be hard for us to justify the need of what are we using to base the need for that 13th playground when you have 12 and the state average for a city our size is 5.
Okay, so this is a metric used in justification for grants too.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So
it's
in our
content.
narrative, what we're
Exactly.
gonna say is that, you know, we're trying to get this park, this playground. Our parks plan says we need to expand playgrounds because we only have 1. The standard matrices say that a city our size should have 5. So clearly, we do not have enough playgrounds, and this would definitely benefit us. So.
And they would probably assign a score to that at some point in that
In
process,
the-
because
in the
everything
grant application.
comes down to a score.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
and, you know,
I'm just curious why they're the gold standard, but I guess they are the gold standard for this kind of deal.
Yeah, the NRPA is what's been quoted for decades.
Okay,
And that's why they actually self-evaluate, said people are using this information possibly not to their benefit because they're trying to hit our benchmarks. And that's why they decided to go with this metric system and say, here's where you compare. It's not a benchmark, but it's a good way for you to see how you stack up and where your needs or your opportunities are.
okay.
And yet it ultimately goes into when they score your application, you know, out of 100 or however many points it is. And if you got 12 parks and you're asking for a 13th, but everybody else has 5, you know, you'll get maybe a 3 instead of a 7. You know, that's how they evaluate it.
Okay.
I mentioned the parks classifications in the earlier slide. There's sort of, all the parks are broken down by those classifications in this table shown on the area and facility inventory slide. Really looking at it, the parks in Borger sort of broke down into 3 categories. Mini and pocket parks, so Crawford, Center City, Little Keeler, you know, those little ones that provide amenities, but they're just not big enough to provide a whole lot of amenities. Neighborhood parks are ones that are a step above that, Coalfield being kind of the biggest. and then some in between. I think West Gateway's another good example, Skittles. They're bigger, they serve more of a neighborhood scale. And then there's the special use parks, which is the Johnson Sports Center, the nature trail that's over there, Agnes Howe, the Huber Ballpark. Yeah, they have a purpose. Now, Johnson has several purposes, but that's such a big facility, it really fit into that sort of regional special use facility, and it offers some very unique things in Borger, the pool, horseshoe pits, other ball fields, that it's its own entity. Same with Agnes Howe. If you're going to Agnes Howe, you're pretty much going there to play some sort of sport event, whether it be football or baseball. It's not more of a passive park like other parks where people come and go like Huber. And Huber is listed here as well based on its size.
Is Huber considered a neighborhood park?
Huber's considered a special use or regional park in this plan because it just, at some point, there's a cutoff too based on acres where you're just serving more population. So
Yeah,
it was
'cause
put
that's-
into this category. So each, as we went through this, we realized just based on the number of parks, we wanted to break it down a little further. A lot of times in a plan like this, all sort of parks would just be tallied in one big table, but it made more sense to compare the mini pocket parks and the neighborhood parks to themselves and possibly Agnes Howe. So this plan specifically has 3 tables that look like this one here. We've just shown the mini pocket park for tonight's presentation. But what this does is we went out in July and hit every park. We counted all the benches, the trash cans, the grills, the swings, all of it. Spent 2.5 days making sure we got everyone noted, and they're all sort of tabulated in these tables here. As part of that process, we don't just count, we look at the conditions of everything. This shows the table that summarizes our conditions assessment. It's based on 15 criteria, where it be the landscaping, the condition of the equipment, the fields, whether there's sidewalks, lighting, whole number of things to kind of set up those best practices for parks. We wanted to see what they were, and this bottom row is basically a sort of average score for each park to compare where they are to each other. The lower the score, the better. The way this system works is 0 means that's the best you can be, up to 4, which is the worst ranking. And the scores across the bottom, they're not compared to national standards. These are just how Borger's parks compare to one another, with Rock Creek sort of being on the high end of that, and then City Center and Johnson kind of being on the lower end, because they're pretty formal. They got a lot of amenities, all those things. Should also point out too, if a park doesn't offer something, it doesn't count against that park. It was just omitted from the final score, the final average.
And to kind of go on to Milton's point too, Gary, who's at home watching on Facebook, wanted to reinforce the fact that Texas Park and Wildlife doesn't require a plan, but you get bonus points if you have an acceptable plan. And our experience and PRPC's experience is those points, if you don't have them, you're not going to be competitive. So while it's not absolutely required, you pretty much have to have it to be competitive. And then what they do is they're looking for is funding the projects that are identified as high priority in the plan.
Okay.
After that physical evaluation of all the plans and looking at the standards and the existing conditions, we move into the needs assessment and prioritization part, which is partially what Garrett was just mentioning, and determining need. So your priorities come from the needs identified through these efforts. We looked at 2 versions of that. There's the physical needs based on how many parks you have or playgrounds, and also all those public engagement activities we did and what the people of Borger think or want, to be added to their park system. So it really breaks it down into two versions of that. This slide, it's again those NRPA metrics, except now we know, at this point in the plan, we know how many are actually out there. So you have that comparison to say, here's, excuse me, that average that is nationally, and you can see if you're way above or way below and where those priorities and those needs are. This slide speaks to that sort of what we were talking about earlier with the ULDO and the service areas. One thing we noticed is in certain sections of Borger, if you draw kind of a ring around the smaller parks or a bigger ring around the bigger parks, these are the areas that you'd logically see serving those residential populations surrounding them. There's a lot of overlap. And so we started to look at that and say, there's a lot here. There's a lot of repetitiveness in the amenities offered. grills, playgrounds, benches. A lot of parks have the same thing, you know, older play equipment, new play equipment, those things. But there's not a lot of variety out there, and they're all sort of clustered in similar parts of town, or sort of in the north and east especially, that's where there's a lot. And so moving on from, you know, the more data-driven parts of the needs is the public involvement summary. This is a couple of pages out of the plan. There's a lot more to it in the plan that we've summarized, but this really looks at a list of all the things that came up during those efforts that people said, we'd like to see this in Borger. You know, this is what the community said they wanted, everything from putt-putt courses, motocross parks, you know, just sidewalks, trails came up a lot, and there's another slide devoted to this, so I won't get too much into that now, but this is, you know, mentioned multiple times, mentioned once, it's all here. And so it can be used to help evaluate when you apply for those grants and look at future opportunities. Here's the things that make sense based on what the community wants, based on what the data tells us, you know, moving forward. And trails were brought up a lot. And there, you know, there's the one nature trail there. It's more of an off-road trail, not necessarily for everybody you can walk and bike on, but that was repeatedly asked for through this whole process. So what we've done is identify some potential trail networks shown on the right and left hands of this slide. That was based on what we saw from really wide right-of-ways, or potentially where you can maybe fit one in an existing alley or in between the road and that alley. And also it links very important parts of town. So the image on the right basically shows linking downtown to the high school and the neighborhoods just north of there, and then down to Agnes Howe Park, Huber Park, the school campus, you know, on the east side of town, all those things. It's really about trying to figure out a way to get all those things connected so you can have people bike, walk to them, all those sorts of things. The one on the left, which we're calling the North Trail concept or diagram, was really, we looked at available properties out there and noticed there's this old utility right-of-way that's not in use anymore. That kind of starts around Grace Meredith Park and heads west towards the golf course. So we looked at that and said, well, you could connect that, and then you have the golf course is municipal owned. You could probably do a trail around the perimeter of that, not really interfere with the golf course. It's another way to provide some trails and amenities for the residents of Borger.
A question, if you came down, it's 207 from the circle going south, that's state highway. And I guess my concept is, if you put a bike in there, you're gonna just encroach a little bit and have a you know, street markers and a dedicated lane.
Or there's actually alleyways on either side of it, up behind the houses. that you
So
could probably
you're thinking
develop
alleyways.
completely off of the roadway surface.
Okay, because TxDOT would have a lot of say.
Well, and some of that, like, you know, it's not necessarily all bike trails either. These could be safe walking trails, so maybe that's added sidewalks. And, you know, so it's not, they might not all be bike trails, they could be bike trails, but there's, you know, multimodal is the,
Okay, so, but you're thinking more alleys in those areas, just to avoid that.
you could.
Of course, this is a ways out, obviously. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not number
Well,
one.
and you have shoulders there, you know, so there could be some conversions for the shoulders. I think on Cedar, you know, we definitely, you know, when you plan it, you're gonna wanna probably cost in some sort of physical barrier down Cedar. You're not gonna
Yeah.
want
Just
just a marked bike lane down Cedar, so that would be
Exactly.
looking at pylons or a raised concrete divider, or, you know, and that's
you know,
the issue there. But of course, the north side of Cedar's not near as bad as, say, 10th to the Cloverleaf.
Well,
but-
see, I'm thinking trails like, kind of like how the parks, I mean, in, you know, green space, or, you know, like parks. I didn't realize we were talking about bike trails on the roads and stuff.
Yeah, and really what we're trying to show here is a logical network of trails that come together, and it can be any combination of those where they make sense. Around the golf course, for instance,
Yeah, that would be, yeah.
that could be more of a nature trail. Where you could even have those little plaques that show this is, you know, this type of tree and some information on it. It could be gravel, you know, it doesn't have to be paved for bike paths,
Yeah.
but it just makes sense for a trail of some kind to go around the golf courses. It's really what this is highlighting. And same with, you know, putting a trail next to Cedar.
Yeah.
There's a lot of right width between the edge of the pavement and I think the fences is what we were looking at. So it's possible to do something there. You have to go through those processes with TxDOT and evaluations, and more people that are experts in planning
Right.
trails and things of that nature, but there's space there. Even if, the one idea I had when I was first looking at that was, there's the swale, that's the drainage. I mean, that could be covered. It would, it would be pricey, but you could put pipes under there and cover it and possibly use that. There's ways to do it. It's more about cost and opportunity.
Well, and
But
like,
it makes sense
The
logically.
alleyway, you could improve the alley, and make it wider, and in an alley, you could have marked bike lanes on the alley, just with paint, because you're away from the roadway, but if you're on the roadway, it's just, we hear that some in the feedback and stuff like that, is how do you link all parts of town with a safe passage that doesn't require a car? And so I think what Matt's talking about is that could be a combination, there might be some areas where you have to walk your bike because it's not safe to have a bike trail, but you just walk it and it's connected to the bike trail so you can get it across Cedar and then you get back on the bike.
Well,
I used to
think-
ride my bike on Cedar all the time.
And there's some established funding programs out there, like Safe Routes to Schools and things like that through TxDOT, that we, explore those for various bits and
For
pieces.
those
of it.
areas.
But as we work with the TUF and the transportation user fee and work on sidewalk expansions and curbs, this helps us kind of see where the trail paths might be. So as we build out the connections from the parks, we make sure that maybe it's tied into an area where we could have a trail, or that trail might develop at some point.
Yeah.
So this definitely gives us a lot of guiding documents as we're starting some of those little steps. Right now we're funding maybe this current budget year, maybe a total of 8 blocks of sidewalk development, but it's important for us to know that those 8 blocks over the next couple of years are gonna turn into and connect into a bigger plan.
Yeah, that's why we have a plan.
Yeah.
And to that point, we had very similar conversations with staff and meetings with the Make Borger Beautiful Committee and others. That's why we've also incorporated this Bulldog Loop, which is internal to the Johnson Sports Complex. So as maybe a first step in a trail network, and we worked with Park Hill, Chad's here, who helped design this. That's one you could take on, more in the short term.
Right.
Maybe not next year, but
Well,
certainly.
they are working on a trail right now out in that area, Make Borger Beautiful and Six Pack.
Right, the mountain bike trail, I
Yeah.
believe. Yeah, this is more of a combination walking,
Okay.
biking trail for,
And I think
to
what we're
provide some
talking
of
about
that.
here is probably improved sidewalks,
Okay, I
that do
see.
link all the facilities, and especially as we get the dome renovation
Yeah, that
going, and
makes
you've got the
sense.
youth center out there, and now the new football
They
stadium.
can walk.
The ability to link all of the amenities in that facility with a nice
Makes
walking path, marked bike path, so that you can take full advantage of all the amenities, even maybe if you can't park at the amenity that you're at.
Yeah.
Because I think all of our goals in that whole area is to have more bigger events, because, we hear that a lot from the community. We want more to do, we want more events. So how do we make those areas convenient and flexible when we start getting more people down there? Right now, it's really easy to go park at Johnson Park to hit the trails, but what if it gets so popular that parking fills up? How do you get from the dome to the nature trail? How do you get
Yeah.
from the dome to the ball fields, because you got something going on? And I think that's the goal with the Bulldog Loop.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that, it's about connecting facilities. One of the first things we noticed is you can park at the youth center,
Yeah.
but there's no real trail even to get you to the dog park in those areas. So providing those kind of more safe ways to do that, get around the different amenities in the Johnson Sports Complex, but also you'll see that it's designed on this diagram as a series of loops, either around the youth center or around the bigger parks with different mileages. And over time, as these trails have been developed, it's been evidently clear through survey work for decades that people like loops. They can park somewhere and walk down a trail and eventually get back to where they parked. So that's that's one of the important components of this design. And Johnson Sports Complex has enough space to do that internally, so you can have a new amenity while you're working on the bigger network thing. So that's why that was shown here.
And if you want to walk 3 miles, maybe that's one loop in the Johnson Park Center instead of, 14 laps around Huber Park?
Yeah. That's great.
Then the final section of the plan is the implementation and implementation steps. There's 5 top-level priorities as we framed them. And they're based on those needs and those priorities we heard. The biggest one is really looking out and evaluating the parks and saying, we have all these parks that are near each other, and they have overlapping amenities, playground equipment, et cetera. Maybe some of those parks should be used for something else, like community garden is one example that we've referenced. Or we did a little research and found out to help maybe drive business to town, you could possibly lease park space to an enterprise that might run a putt-putt golf facility or a motocross facility because we know that's popular in the area. So that's really a big part of this is going through that effort to analyze those parks and say, all right, here's what the community wants, here's what makes sense on this park. And it makes sense because we already have that a mile, down the road, or not even a mile. Some of these parks there could be 3 or 4 well within a quarter mile of each other. Like Cofield Park, there's also East Coronado and West Coronado and South Coronado. They're all pretty close to each other. There's no need for them to offer all the same thing. And in addition to that, since there's these 5 high-level priorities, we provided a table with sub-action steps. You don't have to follow them specifically, but these are the things we've looked at and said these logically make sense to help bring those top priorities to fruition. In a case like we were just talking about, you probably have to repeat that multiple times to get to where you want to go. But that's a good thing, because then you can evaluate each park individually and see what the community wants there and what makes sense based on the other findings in the plan. And I know Borger's already doing this to some extent with posting surveys on Facebook, what kind of play equipment do you want here? So it's really just an extension of those efforts backed up by a little more data. And then the final part, there's not a slide for this, but there's appendices that basically summarize all the public engagement activities, all the comments we received, the online survey responses, how this part, the sections in this relate to that TPWD, acceptable plan criteria, et cetera. With that, I'd take any questions or comments that you have.
Matt, it shows great effort and work. I wish I could win the lottery and pay for it all.
Yeah.
But you gotta have a plan, so we start with a plan and then do what we can finance, and we hope to get the ball moving with lots of grants. I mean, the ball's already moving. We're doing good stuff. These guys have done great work with getting that kind of money. But thank you. Your plan shows a lot of work.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Borger made it easy. We got a lot of great feedback and had a lot of time and ability to get out there and put all the effort into this we needed to get to this result. So I mentioned this during the downtown plan, but I think the city council staff, the plan commission, the tiers board, the Make Borger Beautiful committee, all the residents that participated, it really helped. I mean, it made our job so much easier.
Yeah, we have a lot of people who care about this city.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That
Sure,
was
great
evident
citizens.
from our first trip during the comprehensive plan, and it's only gotten more evident as we've continued to work, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, we'll open a public hearing on the Parks, Trails, and Recreation Master Plan. If anyone would like to speak, and I see no one, so we'll close the public hearing. And we'll move to item number 11, which consider and take appropriate action on resolution R-001-21, adopting the Borger Downtown Revitalization Plan. Mr. Spradlin.
So this is the resolution that is the official action of the council to adopt the plan. If approved, this plan becomes city policy, and city staff will work to begin implementing the priorities established in the plan. Now, again, it doesn't guarantee anything, but, this will guide our actions and how we prioritize and how we draft the budget towards these plans, just like the comp plan will. The next item also, I'll just go ahead and talk about it. It's exactly the same, except it's for the parks plan. So again, these are just the official action to make the plans policy of the council.
Okay. Then I'll entertain a motion on item 11.
I move to approve resolution R-001-21, adopting the Borger Downtown Revitalization Plan.
Second.
And all in favor? And it passes. Item 12. I'll entertain a motion.
I move to approve Resolution R-002-21, adopting the Borger Parks, Trails, and Recreation Master Plan.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And it passes. And item 13, consider and take appropriate action on a prescribed fire services cooperative agreement between the City of Borger and Global Frontline Solutions to support the prescribed fire services agreement with the Oklahoma State University System. Mr. Edwards?
Sure. You know, Chief Watson was here and gave you all a good explanation in the work session. Basically, this agreement is a subcontract agreement with Global Frontline Solutions, who has a government contract with Oklahoma State University for some prescribed fire work. We'll be working for GFS. The contract basically sets out liabilities and you know, we'll be responsible for our own personnel and our own equipment and things like that. But it's a great opportunity to bring in some funds into the hazard mitigation program to offset some of the costs of that growing program, which, you know, it's a great program that we've had, but, you know, it's like any other program, it costs money, and we have an opportunity to offset some of those costs with some paid work. I think it's a great opportunity.
Absolutely. Does anyone have any questions or comments or?
I would just say that we probably talked to the chief 45 minutes, an hour.
Probably.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah.
And we're fortunate to have a great fire department. We're one of the few cities to get fire-wise. Most people don't realize they get a break on their home insurance if they own their own home. They get a fairly substantial break because we meet that national criteria. I guess it's national, is it not? It's a national
It is.
criteria, and that the insurance agencies don't like giving up money, but they recognize that if a city goes to certain efforts, and our fire department has gone to great efforts and does a lot of things right, and has a lot of expertise, and they are sought after for their fire mitigation and wildfire fighting skills and training. And I always like to be able to brag when the bragging is merited, and we like our fire department. They do good work.
For sure. Anyone else? If not, then I'll entertain a motion.
I move to approve the prescribed fire services cooperative agreement between the City of Borger and Global Frontline Solutions, LLC, and authorize the city manager to execute the contract on the behalf of the city.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And it passes. And then item 14, consider and take appropriate action to adjourn.
Who buckles
Go
first?
for
I
it.
move to
You
adjourn.
buckled. Second.
All in favor? And we are adjourned. And thank y'all so much for attending. And thank y'all for being here to answer questions.
We didn't throw any curveballs to Park Hill, so.
And
I guess
Pearson, thank
that's
you for
good,
being
huh?
here with BYAC.